Chapter 71 Undercurrent. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Still maintaining the role of a warm hospitable guest, the Silver Knight boomed enthusiastically, "Glad to have you here, Mr. Xavier, truly." More careful than he had been a few moments ago, Xavier didn't issue Dale an immediate reply. Instead, he merely grunted something inaudible. Dale didn't seem to mind. As he reached out to pour out a cup of coffee for himself, he continued his attempt to engage Xavier in a friendly chat. "I believe you might have already heard the whispers, but you're something of a local legend around here." Xavier feigned surprise at the release of the information. Dale noted his reaction and pounced on it immediately to further the conversation. "Oh yes, I can tell you for sure that this isn't a baseless fib." As he spoke, he poured out generous amounts of coffee into a fine set of china stationed on the table to his far right. The delicious steam soon filled the air, giving it a sort of homely vibe, and slowly eradicating the cold generic atmosphere that came along with official place of business or workplaces. Xavier thought to himself, "These fancy folks here sure do love their coffee." He made a mental note to not be seduced away by the inviting scent of the beverage drink. Xavier didn't know much about this place, but one thing he knew was he couldn't trust anyone. Especially this sweet-talking fellow seated behind the large desk and sipping coffee in a fancy manner. Dale was no fool, he knew Xavier was on guard. So, it wouldn't be easy to warm up to him and pry away the answers he was hoping to get from him. So, Dale deployed every weapon he had in his charismatic arsenal, as he tried to charm Xavier into letting down his guard. He took on the role of a friend and enhanced it further by toning down his extravagant words and fancy speech. The Silver Knight was dying to know everything there was to know about the mysterious and powerful man seated across from him. Dale was willing to do everything possible to make sure his curiosity was satisfied. He sipped his coffee gingerly to maintain a kind of chill vibe that masked his desperateness, as he threw subtle questions hidden in the seemingly harmless banter. "The tales of your exploits traveled all the way from the scene of the battle to Victoria City. I must admit it, Xavier, I was skeptical myself of the whole news at first. It seemed pretty preposterous at the time. You can't really blame me, can you?" He looked at Xavier, expecting him to react to the subtle hint he had just dropped, hinting at the fact that Dale was still nurturing some kind of doubt as to Xavier's authenticity. It was a play for his ego, and he had very sneakily dropped it right after praising Xavier. Xavier didn't indulge the Silver Knight's whim. Instead of giving him the words that he was so desperate to get, Xavier simply shrugged, much to the dismay of the entertaining host who was still seeking avenues to plunder any kind of information from Xavier. As a politician, Dale knew more than anyone that words carried power. That was why he always maintained the fact that one could know the type of person a man was just by listening to him speak. Right now, the cautious nature of Xavier was actively robbing Dale of the opportunity to glean any kind of information from Xavier. But he wasn't one to give up easily. Like a dog with a bone, the Silver Knight could be relentless when he wanted something. And so, the interrogation, which was hidden in the form of a conversation, continued between both men. "That was quite a feat you accomplished. I mean, I am no hunter, but even I know that a single orc is problematic enough, but taking out an entire band of orcs. Phew. Now that is something." As Dale spoke, he deliberately left out Xavier's crowning achievement from the list, hoping to provoke Xavier into saying something incriminating. But once again, Xavier simply chuckled, indicating that he was listening, but at the same time, pointing towards the fact that he was not nearly interested in what Dale was saying. Xavier himself was not a great orator or the ideal conversationalist, but even he was familiar with the flow and manner of the conversation. This particular trait also boiled down to Xavier's army background. In the course of Xavier's military career, specifically during his early days, Xavier had dabbled in the science of the human mind. So, his hobby had driven him to hanging around some of the most competent psychiatrists in the army. So, Xavier had picked up a couple of things that came in handy for him along his much later days in life. Xavier couldn't fault the strange knight for choosing to take this path. Though it wasn't justifiable, it was at least understandable. Xavier knew that if the roles were reversed, he would probably consider using this gambit. Strangers weren't to be trusted. And Xavier wouldn't have taken the Silver Knight seriously if he had simply chosen to take Xavier's words and reputation at face value. This was standard procedure. But one thing irked Xavier about the man. It wasn't just one thing, it was a couple of things actually. It was his shiftiness and coy nature that reminded Xavier of a fox. It was also the way and manner with which he had chosen to go about the whole investigation thingy. The stunt he had pulled with the handshake wasn't something that ordinary people could do. So with these thoughts running through his head, Xavier began to deliberate on the fact that maybe Dale wasn't from Earth, where a completely different set of rules applied, which was completely different from this particular Isekai. So, inadvertently, Xavier found it easy to circumvent the landmines which Dale had so cleverly planted in between questions. Like a prey cleverly evading every single trap set by the fowler, Xavier bounced off every question that was intended to ensnare him. Assuming a serious tone, Dale suddenly dropped the cup on the tray to his side and leaned forward. "I have to confess this to you, Xavier." The dramatic Silver Knight paused for effect, hoping that he would capture Xavier's interest with the thought of a juicy piece that was the hot salacious news of a confessed truth. The truth is difficult to come by these days, but I am not one to mask the truth in exchange for some trinkets. So, I must tell you this, Xavier. I truly do applaud your modesty in the face of such an accomplishment. It is truly uncommon. It was all a ruse, but it was all part of Dale's plan. Even a humble man feels good when he is praised about his humility, thus making him vulnerable in the face of adversity. So, having ambushed Xavier with such a personal note, Dale cornered Xavier with another question: "So where are you from, Xavier?" "I am well-traveled myself, but I just can't seem to place your accent." Of course the question had been intended to push Xavier into some kind of reaction, any kind of reaction really. Much like the wind, "I have no permanent place of residence." Xavier's reply was simple and curt. It was still very ambiguous, but it was just the kind of reply that Dale deserved for being so nosy. Outmaneuvered and outgunned, Dale sat back in his chair and chuckled softly to himself. Once again, Xavier had bested him. Indeed, Xavier wasn't a small fish. Dale realized this quickly. But that didn't deter him one bit. In fact, he was a bit excited. The competitive side of the Silver Knight was deeply aroused. His curiosity was also piqued. This was proving to be more interesting than he had originally thought it would be. So, with renewed tenacity, Dale delved back into the conversation that was now a tug-of-war of intellect and ego. Xavier was more than ready for him. Both men went at it with the cold subtlety of shadow warriors. Their battleground was their conversation, and their arsenal was their words. Dale, being the persistent one, was constantly on the attack. When he saw that he couldn't get Xavier through the conventional beguiling, he used his wiles to try to ensnare Xavier into trapping himself in any kind of contradiction or falsehood. But this was like trying to use a net to hold water. His gambit proved to be futile for so many tangible reasons, chief of them being the cold hard fact that Xavier gave him little or no answers to work with. It wasn't as much as his clever omissions as it was about his subtle assertions. With the elusiveness of a cat, Xavier expertly waltzed over every single trap that Dale had set for him. Not showing his full intellectual capabilities, and at the same time, hinting just enough for his opponent to know that he was a deep well of secrets. Chapter 72. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Finding himself at an impasse, Dale admitted to himself that he had found a worthy adversary. That was when he made the announcement conclusively: "Okay, Xavier, getting to know you was a real pleasure." The double meaning behind this statement wasn't lost on Xavier. "But I'm afraid that it is time for you to meet Governor Quaid. His residence isn't too far from here. Don't worry, I will personally lead you there myself." As he spoke, he rose to his feet, gesturing towards the door, indicating that it was time. Xavier's face betrayed no emotion or urgency whatsoever. He maintained a look of indifference and a faraway look in his eye that suggested that he was distinctly bored. He rose up casually as though he had all the time in the world, and followed the shrewd Silver Knight to his governor's abode. As Dale locked his office door, Xavier waited patiently in the hallway for him. Coincidentally, the same female secretary who had ushered him into his presence, happened to be passing by on her way to the lobby. When she saw Dale smiling and making friendly conversation with Xavier, the flabbergasted woman stopped dead in her tracks. What? Impossible, she thought in unbelief. How come the venerable Silver Knight, Dale, is still indulging such a low-life scum? The secretary was stunned. This wasn't how she had expected this to play out at all. As someone who was well aware of Dale's reputation, and as someone who had worked close to him for so many years, she was in the best position to testify that Dale's reputation was not all hype. She had seen firsthand his tactics, as well as their ruthless efficiency in bringing forth desirable results. So, when she saw that Amana.less Xavier automatically ruled him out as a fraud, she eagerly handed him over to Dale, whom she knew was the best person to completely decimate the fraudster. But instead, much to her deepest surprise, she found them fraternizing as though they had known each other for a while now. It was very unsettling. Still very much unsure, she adjusted her glasses again and again, hoping that this was some sort of optical illusion. But alas, it wasn't. The busybody secretary racked her brain, but she couldn't come up with any tangible reason as to why Dale would treat the crook like a royal emissary. Is he merely leading him on, she wondered. Could it be that this is all for Mr. Dale's amusement? I wouldn't put it past him to play a cruel prank on the crook. But the more she observed, the more she knew that her supposition was very unlikely. Like a spy, or a secret agent, she kept herself hidden from their view as she approached them in order to ascertain the truth. Again, she was slammed in the face by the huge embarrassing palm of disappointment. Dale's conciliating smile said it all. For some reason, he seemed to be enthralled by the crook. And for the life of her, she just couldn't figure out why. With nothing to do but stare, she watched as the two men disappeared down a corner, fading away into oblivion and on to whatever it was that they were both up to. As the governing entity over a domain as significant as Victoria City, there was always at least a million things that demanded Governor Quaid attention. Because he was not a ubiquitous, he had to be present in one place or the other, depending on just how urgent the business was. Today was one of those days. When Dale and Xavier got to the governor's office, a sharp, smartly dressed intern informed the Silver Knight and his guest that the governor wasn't on seat. Dale chuckled to himself when he heard the report. This is very much like the governor. Always so busy. I genuinely can't remember the last time I was able to catch him in his office. The intern was still standing. He shifted uncomfortably on his seat, not exactly sure how to respond to the casual chatter. May I take a message for the governor, sir? Oh bollocks. I'll just check in on his official residence. The intern's facial expression turned sour as if he knew something that Dale didn't. Sir, he began apprehensively, I strongly suggest that you leave your message here. Annoyed by the intern's impudence, Dale's countenance suddenly grew dark and a menacing scowl crept over his face. Up till that moment, he had maintained a very cheerful atmosphere. But the intern had made the rookie mistake of mistaking his casual tone for indifference. Dale growled in a threatening voice, Are you actively looking for a way to annoy me? No, sir. I simply wanted to. Are you sure? Because it sounded like you were trying to tell me what to do. Dale turned around to Xavier and asked, It wasn't just me, was it? Did you also hear the insolence? The poor intern shirked back in fright. The issue had skyrocketed really quickly, and he was beginning to feel the backlash. His eyes opened widely, almost as if they were about to pop out of their sockets, and he began to plead methodically, I crave your indulgence, sir, please note that it wasn't my wish to upset you in any way. My humble apologies. As he apologized, he bowed slightly and suspended himself in that position, desperately hoping that the important-looking man wouldn't take this slight to heart. Dale allowed the tension to drag on for another painful minute, savoring every bit of it. He already knew his next line of action, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to enjoy himself a little. That very brief but tense period was fraught with torture for the clueless young intern. He knew just how delicate his position was, so he hoped and hoped that this wouldn't his last day. Finally, Dale exhaled deeply and a warm cheerful smile replaced the intimidating scowl on his face. The switch-up was diabolic, almost psychotic. It showed that no one could ever really tell just what exactly he was thinking. But it was also deliberate, because he knew Xavier was watching. Dale wasn't wrong on that count. Xavier had indeed been watching the whole exchange. The whole charade was just a display of authority. Dale wanted Xavier to see just a taste of the political power he had. But the Silver Knight didn't know that Xavier had his entire background warped in the military. Because he didn't know this, and because there was no way he could have known, the whole display of his power flex was lost on Xavier. Xavier had dealt with more obnoxious and more devious characters who happened to be his superiors at the time. So, he wasn't in the least shaken by Dale's ostentatious display of authority. Dale finally waved off the intern's presumptuousness and dismissed him casually. Excited and relieved, the intern didn't utter a word, he simply rushed out with an impressive speed, hoping that Dale wouldn't consider overturning his decision to let it go. As Dale watched the intern flee, he turned round in his usual breezy way and addressed Xavier heartily, as if nothing had happened. Come on now Xavier, let's go find that rascal Governor Quaid. Xavier hesitated a bit. He had noted the way the intern reacted when Dale hinted at the fact that he might head over to his home. So, he wasn't entirely sure that this was the best course of action. Dale was quick to notice his reluctance. Oh, it's all right, mate. The governor has been known to meet with senior government officials in his home. Most times, he has lunch with some of them and most times, he ends up talking about political issues for hours on end. With that, he egged Xavier on and the two of them headed towards the exit of the building. Walking side by side as peers, the two well-built men passed through the lobby on their way out. Several people recognized Dale and greeted him respectfully. Xavier had never felt more invisible in his life than he did at that moment. People seemed to look right past him. Like the sun next to moon, Dale's stardom totally eclipsed Xavier's seemingly non-existent personality. Soon, they came out of the great oak doors and burst out into the main street. Hold on a minute Xavier, you need to see the sweet ride I have arranged for our transit. Xavier began to see why several people were drawn to Dale. Aside from his dubiousness, he was actually a charismatic person. He had a rich personality that endeared people to him. Xavier opened his mouth to reply him but there was no need. Trotting down the left lane of the street, cruising at a comfortable speed was a magnificent coach. It was the typical generic horse-drawn carriage that was common in the city. No, this was a world-class coach that was worthy of a statesman. Chapter 73 Governor, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Dale couldn't hide it, it was evident in his satisfying grin and his worshipful gaze, he was proud of this carriage. Xavier was amused. It was clear to him that no matter the continent or timeline, powerful men were the same everywhere. They absolutely loved their cars, automobiles, and in this case, horse-drawn coach. The coach finally stopped on the sidewalk and the driver, an eccentric fellow with a top hat and a whip, hailed the Silver Knight. Good day, sir. Ready whenever you are. Dale replied him excitedly. We'll be right down, my good man. He patted Xavier on the back and said. That's our ride, mate. Let's be on our way, shall we? Not waiting for his reply, Dale hopped down the few stairs on the pavement and landed on the sidewalk. Some guard who was close by immediately reached to open the carriage door for him. Xavier followed suit, and in a couple of minutes, both men were seated comfortably in the back of the coach as they made their way to the residence of the governor. The opportunistic Dale took advantage of their brief moment together to try to pry into Xavier's background. Like a wolf, he nibbled around Xavier's armor trying to find a chink in it. "So, tell me about yourself, Xavier. So far you've been awfully cagey about yourself." Xavier shrugged. "There's nothing to tell, Mr. Dale. I am just a simple man." Dale scoffed at his last statement. "Come on, Xavier. I gather that you are a pathologically modest person. I respect that, but come on, you've got to give me something to work with here." Xavier's mind was working overtime trying to keep the intruder out of his personal space and away from any information that could potentially hint at his true background. "I'm afraid you've got rather high expectations of me, Mr. Dale. Besides, I could very well say the same about you. We're literally strangers who only just met." "Indeed. On some level I guess you're right. But I am something of an open book myself. If you need to know anything, you only need to ask." "But I didn't. I could have, but I didn't." Dale took a minute to allow Xavier's winning argument sink in. He couldn't believe he had fallen for such a basic rhetoric cudgel. Xavier had used his own words against him, and turned it around to support his claim. It had been beautifully done. Even Dale couldn't argue with that. After a few very uncomfortable minutes of silence, Dale went at it again. This time, he chose a very different angle. "You make a valid point, Xavier, but you seem to have misunderstood my intentions." He sat upright, folded his arms and continued. "You forget one thing, my dear Xavier. I sit at the head of the council that determines whether or not you're fit enough for the award. Now, while I myself am personally convinced, I need a few details about you to present to the council." As Dale spoke, he explained his position in a calm, clear voice, appealing to the emotional side of Xavier with the hope of eliciting some kind of sympathy from him. Of course, this was just another manipulation. And Xavier saw right through the thinly veiled conceited deception lurking at the edge of his speech. "You have spoken well, Mr. Dale. But this award should be based on my accomplishments and not on any other factor. I'm sure you agree with me." Dale made a move to speak up, but Xavier continued, acting as if he didn't see him gathering the nerve to counter or agree, or whatever side he wanted to take this time. "Besides, I do recall you saying a few minutes ago that you yourself were personally convinced, so I'm sure a man of your status will surely manage to see that things fall through accordingly." Dale was once again astounded by the stranger. Once again, Xavier had used his own words against him. Aside from his insanely dark blood, red aura, the only thing Dale had gotten so far about Xavier was that he was an astute listener. Not only that, Xavier was also equipped with the skill and wit that was vital to flipping a person's words against them. It was uncanny. But in a way, Dale felt that it was also to be expected from a hidden master such as Xavier. Outgunned and outplayed, Dale found himself chuckling as he thought to himself, "Too bad, Xavier, if you weren't so reserved, you would have made for a perfect politician." And so, after another unsuccessful attempt of trying to pry into Xavier's past, Dale backed off for the time being. The magnificent coach paved its way through the streets of Victoria City and emerged in a different section of the city. Here, the distinct noise that was typical of the noise of the inner city was nowhere to be found. Xavier strained his ears to listen to the familiar hustle and bustle of the streets, but none came. There was only the steady trotting of the horses, and the scraping of the metal wheels on the concrete road. The occasional noise of another horse marching by was heard at very long intervals, but other than that, there was no other way of knowing where they were based on the sounds of the environment. Xavier fought the instinct to look out of the window for any clue whatsoever. However, he soon realized that the pervading silence was all the noise he needed. Sure enough, at that point, a soft wind blew through the carriage. With it came the ruffling of the curtains, and consequently, a brief view of the environment outside. Just as Xavier suspected, they had left the inner city way behind them and they were now ascending up a hill. The ascent wasn't noticeable in the sense that, as passengers seated in the coach, it was almost impossible to know that they were forging their way up a hill. The slope was carriage-friendly, and the road was smooth. Xavier's brief but insightful view of the outside, as well as the encompassing silence, told him that this was a secluded territory. The tall buildings and closely packed edifices of the main city weren't seen anymore. In place of those concrete edifices were a string of elegant, brilliant white manors and estates. All of them were evenly distributed, and space was ample. The vegetation in the surroundings were well taken off. Brilliant-looking guards on horses occasionally patrolled the road, their stern eyes looking for anything that was out of place. As Xavier and Dale journeyed on in silence, the driver announced that they had arrived at the Golden Estate and would soon be at the governor's mansion. Dale unfolded his previously crossed legs and sat up in one graceful movement. He leaned forward to his own window and lifted up the curtain to place their location and calculate their approximate time of arrival. With a thoughtful look, he whipped out his pocket watch and glanced at it. 6 minutes, he said aloud. Shouldn't be long now, old chap, so just hang on a bit, all right. Xavier nodded his head, acknowledging his message. Xavier did not have a timepiece on him, but as the carriage pulled to a stop a short while later, Xavier knew that the Silver Knight's estimated time of arrival had been spot on. Almost immediately, a short but prominent knock came on the door. Dale coughed and a guard opened the carriage door, greeting Dale as he ushered him out. "Good afternoon, sir." "Afternoon, is the governor in?" "Yes, indeed." "May I inform him of your arrival?" "Yes." "Inform him." The guard was only asking out of courtesy. Dale knew that the moment his carriage had set foot in this estate, intelligence must have reported back to the governor that he was on his way. This was a system that had been put in place in order to prevent any surprise attack or visitors. So, by the time anyone arrived at the governor's place, the governor would have been briefed already and well prepared. Dale was well aware of this arrangement. Heck, it had been his idea in the first place. But because protocols were protocols, he had to endure the whole charade. The guard barked brash orders to a couple of other guards and they responded instantly. They fled in the direction of the manor as if they had fire underneath their feet, rushing to do their chief's bidding. The main guard turned to the guests at the gate and said, "Please, follow me, sir." He made sure to keep his voice and tone polite at all times. As a guard who had served the governor for so many years, he knew just how egocentric and unnecessarily sensitive some members of the ruling class could be. Especially the wives of these government officials. So, even when he asked them to follow him, he always made sure to say, "Please," and to also smile in order not to seem commanding. Chapter 74 Intrude. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The guard handed them over to a servant at the gate with instructions and returned to his duty post. The well-groomed male servant, clad in the official uniform of the household staff, led both Xavier and Dale into the estate, and Xavier was taken in by the brilliance of the whole scene. It took him a while to get it all in. Of course, Xavier had seen much more complex architecture. He had also seen the style of European manors and estates in movies and dramas, but there was something gripping and compellingly astounding about seeing such a retro architectural structure in real life. The first thing Xavier noticed was the well-nurtured trees on both sides of path that led down to the actual building. He felt like he was taking a walk down a very secure park. The trees weren't all uniform in color, no. They were a collage of nature's display of diversity. The different colors splashed against each other, competing for beauty and at the same time, enhancing each other's beauty. Like tall beautiful sentinels on guard, they stood majestically of the opposite ends of the road, swaying with the wind and filling the air with a natural fragrance. But the trees were only a small part of the whole scene. As Dale and Xavier progressed down the path that is best described as a driveway, like a budding flower, the trees finally gave way, revealing the real jewel behind. The main building itself stood on a rock. It was something between a castle, an ancient Roman noble's house, and a relatively modern European manor. It was absolutely magnificent. The three-dot story, castle-like manor was painted in a brilliant white. Its pillars were glazed with marbles and gigantic life-sized statues were strategically placed at the entrance and at the four corners. On the east wing of the compound was what appeared to be a fountain with a small garden on the side. The full glare of the afternoon sun accentuated the white paint, enhancing the already intimidating sight of the mansion. Indeed, this was a lofty vestibule. The servant led Dale and Xavier down a complex series of corridors, before finally arriving at the waiting room. No doubt, Xavier was a little impressed. He showed a very negligible amount of interest in the retro style of the mansion. Dale had been covertly watching Xavier all this time. He had been careful enough not to give it away, but the whole time, he had his eye on Xavier. When he detected Xavier's slight interest in the awesome sight that was the governor's mansion, Dale immediately concluded that Xavier was probably from a pretty ancient family and also, he probably grew up in a secluded part of the continent. Dale had expected a simpleton like Xavier to be awed by the majestic splendor of the mansion, but when he saw that Xavier's interest was only mind, Dale also jumped to another conclusion, that Xavier's very little interest in the lavish and tastefully furnished mansion was probably an attribute of a great master. Maybe he had sworn to detach himself from the material things of this world. He wondered. Damn, this isn't good. The whole evidence points towards the fact that he might be a master in disguise. Satisfied with his own conclusions, Dale wheeled his mind away from Xavier, instead focused on the governor. Dale knew the governor well enough to guess that he was probably in a heated discussion with some executives. Dale himself had been part of the project a while ago, so he knew more than anyone that it would take a significant amount of time to navigate around the parameters of the project. To say that a satisfactory result could be obtained within a short period would be a far cry from the truth. Dale couldn't sit still. He began to pace up and down the room until he finally decided that waiting wouldn't get him anywhere. He had to interrupt the meeting, else, it could be a while before he could get to see the governor. So, without uttering a word to Xavier, without even the slightest glance, Dale stormed out of the waiting room. Xavier was a bit surprised at the way and manner with which the Silver Knight had excused himself. It was almost like he had snapped or something. So, with the Silver Knight gone, sitting by himself with no company whatsoever, once again, Xavier found himself alone in a waiting room. It wasn't an established rule, neither was it written formally in the laws of the state, but it was common knowledge that the governor was not to be disturbed when he was at a lunch meeting with other officials. The only exception to this rule was the venerable Silver Knight. Dale. Indeed, to just about every other official, it seemed like Dale was the only one who could dare cross this line by interrupting the governor. This wasn't because Dale was a close confidant of the governor, neither was it because of any fancy reason like the governor had given Dale a special privilege to do so. Nay, this was because Dale had read the situation and decided to use his discretion. Objectively speaking, he knew that the governor would prefer to deal with the issue of the mysterious stranger than so sit for hours on end, debating on mundane topics that were sure to be potentially fruitless. Dale knew that the governor would definitely choose receiving the stranger. So, armed with this knowledge, Dale did the unthinkable and barged into the dining area where the governor was hosting his officials. Nothing could stand in the way of Dale when he truly wanted something. So, when the guards at the entrance to the dining room saw him, they recognized his authority, as well as the air of urgency around him, and therefore held their peace. With calculated aggression, knowing fully well what awaited him on the other end of the door, Dale poured a sufficient amount of strength into his arms and forced the doors to the dining open. The dining room, which had been filled with ramblings and old men discussing, suddenly went silent when they saw how the doors were flung open. There came the shock at first. They couldn't imagine being interrupted by anyone at all. So, angrily, they turned their heads in the direction of the culprit that was responsible for the crudely executed invasion. Shock soon returned to the faces of the previously annoyed officials. The looks of surprise on the faces of the officials when they saw Dale furiously charging into the room was priceless. None spoke a single word. Not a single one of them found the words to address Dale. Astounded, they watched as Dale ignored every single one of them and marched straight to the governor. On every timeline, and on every continent, even cutting across the solid iron barrier of time, cultures and dynamics, one truth always remains. Executive meetings can be hellishly boring. The constant droning out of facts and figures, the long negotiations, and the general atmosphere of utmost seriousness can make the responsibility of administration a real burden. So, any form of disruption, in any way, almost always leaves an earth-shattering effect. For the executives who were knee-deep in negotiations with the governor, this was the last place they had ever expected to be interrupted. As political leaders, each and every one of them had a stake in the project at hand. In some way or the other, all of them had something to benefit. Either from government-issued contracts to their private firms, or just general strategic positioning that was sure to make them look good in the upcoming elections. So, it was safe to say that their hearts and minds were very much invested in this lunch meeting with the president. So, when the doors to the most exclusive meeting in the city flung open in the most audacious way, their surprise knew no bounds. The temerity of the audacity could not really be quantified by any measuring standard. When the shock fully cleared, and when they finally came to their senses, it was a bit too late to react. The Silver Knight walked straight to the governor, who frankly seemed a bit relieved that someone had managed to quell the tension by this disruption, and whispered a message in his ear, "Governor, I thought you might want to hear this. But that fellow who is responsible for the slaughtering of the Orc chief, and the dispersing of the Orc tribe, well, he's here." The governor's face turned white instantly. He almost shouted, "What?" This was definitely not on the list of what he was expecting today. But he welcomed to intrusion with open hands. He struggled to mask his facial expression in order to keep his nervousness hidden from the rest of the officials. But alas, the snake eyes of the government officials had already seen his reaction. Chapter 75. Time you are listening at novelfull.audio. Like a pack of ravenous wolves, they kept their hungry eyes on the governor and Dale, who kept a straight poker face the whole period, hoping to sneak a peek at the inside information. Before any one of them could protest, it was a little too late. For by then, the governor had already regained his composure. "Gentlemen," the governor began assertively as he placed both hands on the long dining table, "in lieu of the fact that another urgent matter has surfaced, I am afraid we have to draw the curtain on this meeting for the time being." The governor had scarcely finished speaking when, immediately, cries of complaints rang across the table as multiple voices rose up at once to protest. "Mr. Governor! I implore you! This is unacceptable! What urgent matter could be more important than this? Your Excellency, please!" They all spoke at once. Each plea, complaint and protest overlapping the previous one, painting the picture of a chaotic assembly and negating the true value of a sit-in discussion. The governor indulged them for a few seconds. He allowed them bicker before raising his right palm in the air, indicating his call for silence. The rumbling slowly died, but not with great reluctance. "I encourage you all to conduct yourselves in a manner that is befitting to officials of this great government. My secretaries will reach out to every one of your offices with the details concerning our next meeting. Good day." With that, he stormed out with Dale on his heels. The governor was actively trying to rein in his excitement at the prospect of meeting such an interesting entity. He had been coked up with administrative duties of late, so, this was the closest he could come to an adventure. On their way, the governor failed to curtail his impatience even though he was just a few minutes away from seeing the local legend. He began to ask Dale some questions. "You've met him, what do you think about him, Dale?" Anticipating this question, Dale replied him with an already prepared answer. "The man is truly an enigma. He is wrapped in so many mysteries that makes him difficult to read." The governor was well pleased with the answer he got. For him, this was just another adventure. The mere thought of a mysterious stranger with the chilling skill and wit to kill the notorious Chief Orc, well, it made him giddy. Almost like a schoolboy on a quest. The governor thought quietly for a moment. So, he's the real deal then. Dale answered him diplomatically, it's way too early to conclude, sir. But by all count, it's safe to assume that he might actually be worth the trouble. The governor chuckled slightly and then said vaguely, it's weird. I beg your pardon, sir. This is the first time I have seen you unsure about a person's character. Makes me wonder. Dale cursed under his breath. This was what he had been trying to avoid. They both trudged on in silence as they approached the hall that led to the waiting room. The governor quickened his pace, and eagerly opened the adjoining doors to the waiting room. With no option than to succumb, the doors responded to the governor's push, and they swung open in full force, opening up the physical portal to the next room where a human prize awaited him. The governor bounced into the waiting room with eager eyes and an anxious mind, hoping to see a kind of medieval hero, or a mage, or at least, a warrior of the state. But alas, instead of any of these things, an empty room greeted him instead. The governor's eyes glossed over every visible square inch of the waiting room, looking for the person he had spent the last 4 minutes envisioning in his head. A cloud of anger began to gather above the governor's head. Is this some kind of joke? He raged. I assure you, this is the worst possible time to mess with me. Where is the man you said was here? Dale? Thinking he had been played, he swung round to address the Silver Knight behind him. But on Dale's face was a look of shock that equaled that of the governor's. He opened his mouth to reply him, but this time, Dale, who always had an answer for everything, was lost for words. He didn't know Xavier all that well, but he didn't think that he would be daring enough to skip out on a meeting with the governor in his own residence. This had better not be one of your mysterious things, Xavier. Dale cursed Xavier inwardly. Damn you! You jerk! Where the hell did you wander off to? It was a bit too late for regrets, but Dale began to realize that, in retrospect, it wasn't exactly to leave a shifty, unproven entity like Xavier unattended in the governor's house. A morbid thought came across Dale's line of thought as he struggled to give the governor a solid reason as why the star prize had suddenly vanished. Wait a minute. He thought to himself, could it be that Xavier might have left already simply because he had lost his patience? Dale's blood ran cold. If that was the case, he knew that it would be a real pain having to track down a man who loved to stay aloof from the world. Not only that, he would lose face seriously in the sight of the governor and his other colleagues if word of this was to ever get out. He had to find Xavier. And fast. Totally oblivious, completely unaware of the commotion he had stirred, Xavier wandered around the posh estate that belonged to the governor. Xavier's decision to go AWOL wasn't intentional. It had all been a huge misunderstanding, and all parties were to blame. When Dale received the message from the butler regarding the governor's lunch meeting with the members of his cabinet, it seemed to Xavier that Dale didn't take too kindly to being asked to wait around. The furrowed eyebrows, the incessant pacing, and the overall look of impatience on Dale's face suggested that he wasn't really going to sit around waiting for a meeting to come to an end. So, when Dale stormed off, marching briskly, and heading to an unknown location without updating Xavier on his intended whereabouts and estimated time of return, Xavier concluded what he had already suspected in the first place. Xavier had presumptuously suspected that Dale had lost his patience. As a statesman, Xavier guessed that Dale knew from first-hand experience that the meetings such as this might take up an inordinate amount of time. There was no telling just how long this particular one might take. And judging from the way the Silver Knight had stormed off, Xavier came to the logical conclusion that the end of this meeting might not exactly be in sight. So, faced with what seemed like another long stretch of time that was filled with the gloom of boredom and inaction, Xavier sighed inwardly, before making the conscious decision to explore the governor's estate. What could possibly go wrong? He thought to himself as he re-examined his plan. By the looks of it, Dale might be gone for a while. Xavier remembered how only just a few hours ago, he had been bored to senselessness while he waited to be attended to by a government official. And that guy was just a low-ranking official. Imagine how long it would take to get to see the governor on such short notice. The more Xavier thought about it, the more he saw reasons why he should go ahead with his exploration. He turned his head towards the end of the waiting room, in the direction of the hallway that seemed lead elsewhere. Like a portal to a magical world, the courtyard seemed to call out to him, taunting him invitingly, and egging him to try and find out more about his environment. After all, it wasn't every day one got to experience the vintage architectural wonder of the European Middle Ages. There was so much to explore. And Xavier had an abundance of the one resource that almost always proved to never be enough: time. So, with nothing stopping him, and literally no one in sight, Xavier set off like the explorers of old, hoping to feast his eyes on the wonders of this strange and yet densely familiar place, familiar because he had only seen timely pieces like this on TV and in books. Coincidentally, at that same moment, some 200 meters away in the dining section of the estate, Dale and his governor were actively making their way towards Xavier in great haste and with even greater curiosity. So, in a bid to escape the stifling, mundane grip of the goddess of boredom, Xavier ended up leaving a tide of commotion in his wake. But of course, he didn't know that. Chapter 76. The girl. You are listening at novelfull.audio. All he cared about this time was making the best use of the new scene to feast his eyes and keep the threatening boredom at bay. Xavier was under the impression that waiting for a leader was a tasking job that demanded a serious amount of patience. In this case, the leader in particular was a governor of a whole state capital. So, Xavier reassured himself that he had nothing to worry about in that regard. Xavier embarked on his wandering mission, fully prepared for the inactivity and placid atmosphere that was to be expected from a ruler's home. This was the last place he thought he would see trouble. He was right. At least for now. It turned out that the open courtyard had been situated in the middle of the mansion. This maximized the air flow in the mansion and balanced the concrete-to-vegetation ratio within the walls of the mansion. A garden bloomed in the open space, bathing the generic white paint of the walls with a splash of colors. Right in the middle of the courtyard, four marble sculptures of angel-like creatures camped about a water fountain. With open wings, they surrounded the beautiful water fountain like thrown angels. Obviously, Xavier had seen a lot more impressive sights in his day. But there was just something intoxicating about this particular sight. It was the serenity that followed. It also could have been the fact that it was all natural, completely devoid of any tech whatsoever. Xavier navigated his way around the open courtyard. Not allowing himself to be overrun by the allure of his new environment, Xavier kept his mind firmly on the notable landmarks he could use to get back to the waiting room. It was a pretty big mansion and he really couldn't afford to get lost. As Xavier melted through the corridors like a stealthy visitor creeping around, he finally caught his first glimpse of trouble sneaking around the corridors and skulking behind the thick sturdy pillars of the mansion. Obviously, the girl was very familiar with her environment. She took advantage of the multiple pillars, and skulked behind them, looking like an sketchy individual with questionable intentions. Xavier watched the amateur curiously as she slithered about, completely unaware of the fact that she was being monitored at the time. Xavier wondered. What an amateur. She really must be a rookie to leave herself open to be spotted like this. Xavier went into stealth mode and hid himself behind one of the pillars. From there, he observed the sneaky girl closely and took in her features. Facially, the girl was pretty. Not in a flagrant or overbearing way, just a simple face with well-defined features. She looked young. Young enough to be considered Xavier's age mate. As Xavier watched the cute girl, he tried his best to make out her deal. Was she a criminal? Was she a petty thief who was simply looking for a good score? Xavier's pessimistic mind steered him in a completely different direction with a more adventurous thought: maybe she's an assassin. This is a very high-profile target, she must be really good if she was contracted to kill the governor. Xavier wanted to grouse. Just when he was settling into the casual routine of a normal person, here he was, getting sucked into the endless vacuum of another possible trouble. Xavier began to think very quickly. If he ended up being spotted with this intruder, it would be the nail in the coffin that Dale had already prepared for him. It was no longer a secret that the Silver Knight suspected him gravely. Xavier instantly deduced that if this was to implicate him in any way, he would be no better than a chunk of meat in a bowl of hot spicy pepper soup. As he was still wrapped up in his own thoughts, he heard the echo of several feet pattering on the soft polished floor of one of the hallways. Shit! Xavier cursed as he ducked behind one of the pillars. It was too late now. He had wasted time, and now, several servants were scurrying on their feet, rushing towards that very location. Soon enough, a bunch of household servants emerged out of one of the many hallways leading to that particular corridor. From where Xavier stood watching them, he could tell that they were worried. They glanced around frantically, searching for something, or someone. Xavier soon figured out the fact that the servants were indeed searching for the young girl. What the heck? She's been discovered already. What the hell did you do, you vermin? Xavier whipped his head away from the servants and fixed his eyes on the hiding girl. Xavier froze up when his eyes finally landed on her. Within the very short period he had averted his gaze, she had actually managed to fish him out despite the fact that he had hidden himself in one of the darkest spots where even the rays of light emanating from the reflective surface couldn't him. Xavier was surprised. Somehow, she had spotted him. Even more surprising was the brazen look on her face. It wasn't the look of one who was going to be caught. She looked at him as though he was the one who had been caught. Xavier was thrown off guard by the dramatic shift in the dynamic. The impudent look in her eye wasn't consistent with that of a thief who had just been caught. In fact, it was more of a glare. It was only when she gestured to him to keep silent that Xavier began to think again. The girl lifted up her forefinger to her lips and made the universal sign to keep quiet. She didn't need to exaggerate her movements for Xavier to understand her. Her flaming eyes gave up her request. The air was charged with tension from all parties, including the servants. They breezed around the foremost part of the corridors checking for footprints or skid marks that would lead them to the girl. Luckily, the servants weren't thorough with their search. Xavier didn't envy them at all. It wasn't fault. The mansion was large enough to accommodate an entire school. They had a lot of ground to cover, so they obviously couldn't afford to linger in one location for too long. After a few seconds of just breezing around, they turned around frantically and left to begin their search in another location. A few painful minutes passed in silence as both Xavier and the cute girl waited for the servants to fully retreat. Xavier kept his eyes on the entrances, waiting to see if they were truly gone. When his suspicions were finally abated, he stepped out of the shadows with the intention of heading towards the girl who had almost put him in trouble. Just as he took the first step, mid-stride, he heard someone call his name from behind him. Xavier's face turned sour. His face had the pale discoloration of one who had seen, or in this case, heard a ghost. Xavier wasn't feeling very motivated to turn back to face his accoster. Wait, how did they know my name again? His name came again. This time, it sounded less doubtful and more confident. This time, it also sounded familiar. Xavier turned round with the quickness of a predator. And with unbelieving eyes, he looked at the person who had just outed him. Adelia. True enough, it was Adelia standing right before him, gawking at him like he was some creature that had escaped the confinement of its cage at the zoo. Xavier. What are you doing here? Xavier wanted to ask her the same thing. Then he remembered that at their last meeting, she had been summoned by the governor as well. He opened his mouth to answer her, but then again, Adelia being who she was, she interrupted him with another question. Hold on a minute. Did you happen to see a girl who was running away? Xavier wasn't usually one to snitch, but at this point, he decided that it was best that he dissociate himself from whatever trouble the girl was in. So, without even the tiniest bit of remorse, Xavier promptly pointed to the girl crouched and hiding in the corner. Adelia's eyes followed his fingers and traced the path to a hiding place not too far away. At the end of it all, the young girl with the pretty face came out. This time, instead of her look of condescension, her face was twisted in a mask of rage. Yet again, Xavier found himself on the end of another surprise party. His own over-analytic mind had completely misread the situation. Hence, he was about to be schooled in another one of life's endearing lessons. Appearances can be grossly misleading. Though he didn't know it yet, he was about to find out just how delightfully irrational his perception of the whole scene had been. Chapter 77 Sneaking Out of Class. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Obviously very unhappy, the young girl walked towards Xavier with burning black eyes, ready to tear him apart with the ferocity and anger of a young tigress. With balled fists, she approached him as though she was going to beat him up. You! Just who do you think you are? You actually dared to rat me out. She shook her finger threateningly in his face. My father will have you flayed for this. Xavier was even more confused than ever. This wasn't how he had expected this to go. Why was the criminal so brazen? What was the source of her confidence that made her so audacious even in the face of possible conviction? He turned to face Adelia, hoping to catch an expression that said he wasn't the only one that was going mad. He didn't get the sympathetic response he expected. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Instead of mirroring his own confusion, on Adelia's face was a look of amusement that more than hinted at the fact that she found all of this to be very amusing. Clearly, she knew something that Xavier didn't. Xavier began to suspect that something didn't add up. Hold on now. Wait a damn minute. Xavier thought to himself as he struggled to make sense of the whole situation that looked completely absurd. But the cute girl didn't catch on. With the confidence of a spoilt child who was used to having her way, the cute girl continued her savage verbal assault on the clueless young man. What's the matter, dummy? Cat's got your tongue. Or are you dumb as well? Watching Xavier getting skewered by a teenage girl like piece of meat on a grill wasn't something that Adelia had ever thought she would witness in her lifetime. In her mind, she saw Xavier as a big bad wolf who had decimated an entire tribe of orcs. So, watching him falter under this heat was practically amusing for her. Seeing that Xavier decided to remain silent, the other girl took it as a sign of acquiescence. And like a bloodhound who smelled blood, she honed in on Xavier with the precision of a killer and lashed out at him with another vicious stream of stingers. You better speak up, you uncultured swine. Do you want me to call my father? Because I will. I guarantee you, he is going to make your life very difficult. The young girl wasn't more than 5'5", and yet she spoke with the audacity and energy of someone who was over 7 feet tall and armed with a machine gun. It was only after her last threat that Adelia finally made up her mind to butt in. It's okay, Erlene, I know this one. If that was intended to douse the raging flame that was the cute girl's anger, it turned out to be counterproductive. With burning black eyes, the petulant girl turned her bloodlust on Adelia. What do you mean you know this one? Isn't he one of the servants? She then narrowed her eyes as she turned to look at him one more time, as if trying to make up her mind about what unit of the domestic staff he truly belonged to. Or are you one of the new ones? Even before Adelia finally introduced them to each other, Xavier's quick mind began to make the connection. He wanted to kick himself in the nuts for not reading the signs earlier on. Battle had hardwired his brain into automatically dreaming up the worst-case scenario. He had to constantly remind himself that this wasn't war, he was surrounded by civilians and ordinary folks. Hence, the need to tone down his aggressive analysis of every situation. Adelia's voice rose above the din, and like a peacemaker, she built the bridge between both sides when she finally made the introductions. No, Erlene, this is the dude I was talking about. Xavier raised his eyebrows in surprise. Adelia saw it and dismissed his vile thoughts immediately. Oh, don't flatter yourself, Xavier. It's not like that. Speaking to the girl called Erlene, Adelia continued, so Erlene, I would like to officially introduce the local legend, and the man behind the extermination of the insidious orcs. Mr. Xavier. It was a glowing introduction. Xavier wanted to point out to her that she was wrong about the extermination part. But he decided that now wasn't probably the time to that. Adelia continued in her role as the intermediary and finished the rest of the introduction. And Xavier, I'm sure you've already guessed this as well, but this is the adorable Erline, daughter of the distinguished governor of the state capital. Adelia was right about the part about Xavier already suspecting that Erline was royalty, at least, she was the day's version of a princess anyway. He instinctively bowed low, almost all the way to the waist, thinking that it was probably the norm here. It was Adelia's turn to be amused. Stifling the swelling storm of laughter that was actively gaining momentum in her stomach, Adelia managed to ask with a straight face, Xavier. What are you doing? A puzzled expression crept across Xavier's face. I thought, he began innocently as he tried to explain the basis for his action. But the overly aggressive Erline didn't spare him. Oh. What kind of backwater country are you from? This isn't the olden days, we don't do that here. Xavier swallowed hard. There really was no pleasing this girl. Erline. Adelia exclaimed. Come on. Be nice. Erline didn't look like she was capable of being nice. Instead of apologizing, she folded her arms stubbornly and kept her fierce gaze on Xavier. Clearly, she still wasn't impressed. Adelia assuaged Xavier saying, Don't worry about Erline, she's just grumpy because she was practicing water magic and she ended up sneaking out of class. She's a great girl, I promise you. Somehow, Xavier found it hard to believe that last part. Both Xavier and Erline stared at each other. Actually, in the case of Erline, it was more of a harsh glare and an intensely penetrating gaze, than a simple ordinary stare. Xavier saw no need to dish out one of his favorite homicidal glares for such a young girl. He reserved it for special occasions like when he would be faced with a testosterone-driven primate monster that was almost always other men looking for an ego contest. Each of them analyzed the other person, drawing up conclusions and forming lasting impressions. Erline didn't like Xavier. She made no attempt to make her dislike for him. Indeed, it was clear as day. It was in her body language, it was on her demeaning expression, it was in her spiteful eyes, and it oozed from every word she uttered. It wasn't that Erline hated Xavier with passion, neither was it that she detested him for any reason in particular. Her dislike was based on the fact that she completely looked down on him. She couldn't see anything interesting about him, consequently, it was hard for her to take him seriously. She regarded him as one would regard a worm or a dying insect, with a look of complete condescension, trying to make up her mind if he was worth her or Adelia's time. This can't be right. You look so common, how is it that a runt like you managed to accomplish all of these magnificent feats? What would have been an internal monologue in her own mind was voiced out openly without fear, restraint or remorse. She was used to speaking her mind without any backlash or repercussion. After all, she was the daughter of the governor, no one would dare make her feel unhappy and end up incurring the full wrath of her father. Erline didn't stop there, she dialed up the sass by about 100%, adjusted her already folded arms and continued to systematically tear down Xavier's self-worth. That you are weak. You have no mana, and yet, you claim to have eliminated an entire band of orcs. Tell me, how does this work exactly? The scene was similar to that of a bully situation in a schoolyard. She took a step closer to him menacingly and asked contemptuously, Tell me Xavier, did you manage to do all this by boring the orcs to death? Is that your hidden superpower? The uncanny ability to bore your enemies to death? Erline. Come on. Erline swerved in Adelia's direction with her hands held up in the air in a shrug. Honestly Adelia, what exactly did you see in this bum? He seems to have the IQ of a goldfish. She raised up her eyebrow as she considered another possibility. Adelia, she spoke in a low and subdued tone, hoping Xavier wouldn't pick up on her warning, I hope you haven't fallen for the tricks of this babble-rouser. Oh, please tell me you haven't. Chapter 78 Erling, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Xavier, who had been silent all through this while, finally reacted. He threw his head back, opened his mouth and let out a long, deep, hearty laughter. His laughter was free of the disdain and hateful mockery that would be considered the appropriate response for anyone in his shoes. Instead, it rang of pure amusement, almost as if he had been entertained by a live show. For the first time, Erling truly looked at him. She had never heard anyone laugh like that in her presence. The young cute girl was used to people walking on eggshells around her, so Xavier's reaction wasn't exactly something she was equipped to handle. When Xavier finally managed to rein in his very amusing laughter by bringing it to an end, he cleared his throat and spoke like a sage. You probably haven't realized this yet, but soon enough you'll know that magic isn't everything. There are so many, and I mean so many ways to get there. Erling fought to keep herself from retorting with a witty reply like, for someone who doesn't have magic, you sure do know a lot about magic. But she aptly gauged the situation and decided against it. Erling wasn't stupid. Despite all the vitriol she had thrown his way, when Xavier finally replied, he had chosen to take the high road. This made him appear somewhat reasonable in her sight, so she held herself from any more outbursts. This time, Erling decided to take a different route. She was determined to land at the same destination, but because of his diplomatic approach, and also because he had saved Adelia's life, Erling decided to play the polite/reasonable card. Adelia says that you saved her life. She could have ended up like the other unfortunate soldiers or worse. If you hadn't showed up, it probably would have been a different outcome. For this, you have my gratitude. Xavier was taken aback. For a moment, she actually sounded reasonable. It wasn't something he ever thought was possible. As the daughter of a governor, Erling was required to take classes on diplomatic relations. So, consequently, she could tap into this information at any time and become whoever she wanted to become. But that was just where her politeness ended. Like the sudden switch up if dusk before dawn, Erling's face suddenly grew dark as she continued in the same vein as earlier on. Only this time, more personal and more constructive. But that single word changed everything and set the tone for what was to come. That doesn't change the fact that I think you're a liar and a fraud. I think you're riding on the accomplishment of another fellow who is probably dead. So, you being the despicable creature, you decided to play on his death and use it to your advantage to brag. She took a moment to let it sink in. This was also another diplomatic strategy. Pretend to play nice while advancing, and when you're sure the negotiations are going your way, go out of your own way to ruin it. Erling didn't get the chance to release the venom she already had stored up. Another disruption interfered with the showdown between them. In the short distance away, they all began to hear the clattering of feet in the hallways. The servants were back. This new development didn't sit well with Erling at all. Not one bit. In actuality, Erling had already envisioned that she would definitely fail the next test. Hence, her truancy. The closer the rushing footsteps, the more apparent Erling's desperation became. Xavier noticed this and used it to further his argument. Now here's an example of what I was talking about, a real-life teachable life situation. Erling stared at him like he had just spewed a truckload of trash. She couldn't believe Xavier was droning on about something as unimportant as this. But Xavier wasn't quite done yet. I gather you're trying to escape from your teachers. Now does this situation call for magic or a sharp use of one's intellect? Livid with fury, Erling snapped, you missed me with all that philosophical crap. This is all about magic, you ignorant twerp. She then proceeded to tell them snappily just how close she was to failing the next test. As she finished, she hastily grabbed Xavier's arm and accosted him. You're the reason I'm in this mess in the first place. I wouldn't have been found out if it wasn't for you. You'd better do something about this ASAP. Xavier wanted to protest, but Erling was adamant. The servants were getting closer by the second, so they were indeed in a precarious position. On a regular day, Xavier would turn down a request of this nature, seeing that it was unreasonable and lacked tact. But he had seen the strong cord of friendship that bound Adelia and Erline. So, his interest became fixated on how exactly this would play out. Contrary to what Xavier and the rest believed, it wasn't a bunch of servants that were after them. Two people appeared out in the corner as Xavier and his group spilled into the courtyard. It was a very unlikely duo. An old man with a flowing white beard led the way. Clearly he was advanced in years, but he had the steady gait of one who was still very much energetic. His eyes were full of fire and wisdom, and in that moment, both of his eyes were fixed on Erline. Like a missile system that had locked in on a target, they remained firmly locked on Erline right from the very moment the old man set his sights on her. Beside the old man, flanking him on the left-hand side was another character who didn't seem nearly as interesting as the dignified sage-looking old man. The other character was a young boy. The boy's facial features were similar to that of Erline. In fact, the resemblance was so uncanny that it wasn't difficult for anyone to know on the spot that both of them were indeed related. He looked way younger than Erline. His radiant countenance and his boyish looks suggested that he was at least 13. As the group of three approached the old man and the young boy, Xavier noticed something about the younger boy. While the old man had his eyes burned on them, the younger boy's attention was completely occupied by a very bizarre activity. In his right hand, and stretched out before him was a bucket, and the bucket appeared to be filled with water. Just as the old man kept his eyes on Erline, Xavier kept his gaze on the young boy with the bucket. The boy who resembled Erline had his face taut in an almost tight grimace. His entire mind seemed to be riveted on the bucket of water in his hand. Xavier soon realized that the boy was actually trying to manipulate the water in the bucket to revolt and break the bucket. The hilarious way which the young boy kept twisting his face and making entertaining looks with his eyebrows almost made it look as if he was trying to be funny. But in reality, he was actively putting in all his effort to accomplish the task he had set out to do. In spite of all of his efforts, he kept coming up short each time. When they were finally within ear range, the old man barked his instructions at Erline: "No matter how far you run, your task will always be waiting for you the same way you left it. Get back to work." Erline was obviously not in sync with this particular task. She moved sluggishly, as if trying her best to drag out the time between that moment and when she was about to do it. Reluctance was written all over her. She eyed Xavier with hostility and whispered to him, "This is all your fault, you bum. All your fault. I hope you're happy now." The old man noticed her slacking and charged her sternly, "Get on with it, Erline. Don't let me repeat myself again." Erline didn't out the opportunity to stick out her tongue at Xavier as she proceeded to do what she had been charged with. But Xavier didn't care about her issue, not in the slightest bit. But since Xavier came to this continent and saw firsthand the wonders of magic, he had begun to nurture a silent fascination for it. Even at that moment, Xavier's mind toyed with the idea of getting in touch with magic. He found himself longing to understand the magic that was commonplace in this Isekai. So, with this as his utmost priority, Xavier had little or no time to worry about helping the sassy young lady further down the delinquent path of truancy. Because the old man's eyes had been so focused on his truant student, he had somehow managed to miss Xavier's presence. So, when he finally averted his gaze from Erline, he stared aghast at Xavier, wondering which hole he had crawled out from. Chapter 79. Laddie, you are listening at novelfull.audio. The ever-perceptive Adelia saw that the old man had begun to stare at Xavier inquisitively. She immediately moved to make the necessary introductions. "Forgive my lack of manners." She apologized to both men. "Xavier, this is Sir Laddie, the senior mage here and a world-class, renowned mage. He was recruited specially by the governor to tutor his son and daughter in the ways of the craft." She then turned to the old mage and did likewise. "Sir Laddie, the young man standing before you is Mr. Xavier. He is the hero who is solely responsible for elimination of the orcs' leader. He also single-handedly dispersed the colony of orcs that were subject to the chief orc. Laddie was a man who had seen a lot in his lifetime. He had seen thieves, he had seen power-hungry men, he had seen powerful mages of different proportions, and also, he had seen his fair share of fraudsters, liars and deceitful men who breathed lies just as easily as they breathed air. As the old man looked at Xavier, he looked at him through the filter of his own many experiences with different men over the years. Unfortunately for Xavier, in the old man's mind, Xavier seemed to tick all the boxes that were indicators of the fact that he was indeed a fraud. Thus, unable to rise above his own limitations that had been brought on as a result of his own experiences, doubt clouded the old man's heart, poisoning his objectivity, mudding his perception of the young man who stood before him, and stripping him of his straightforward vision. Though the old man didn't show it on the surface, much like Dale before him, he was very much doubtful of Xavier's capabilities. But the old man wisely chose decorum over blatant straightforwardness. He didn't see any need to call out Xavier as a fraud. It wasn't his place, and it definitely wasn't his business either. What you have accomplished is astonishing. Thank you for bringing Erlene back here. Erlene scowled in the background. Laddie rebuked her sternly and then returned his attention to Xavier. But right now, my students are supposed to be studying and practicing. So, if you don't mind, would kindly request that you recuse yourself for the meantime. The old man was pretty curt. And so far, he had been reasonable. But Xavier had learned his lesson from his previous encounter with Dale. This time, he paid close attention to the old man, and as he related with him, Xavier could tell that the old man didn't trust him at all. In fact, his politeness was just a front to get Xavier to leave as soon as possible. Xavier sighed inwardly. Having to show his powers every time someone second-guessed him was mentally draining. The whole pattern was exhausting really. Especially because of the fact that it was repetitive, with very little variation or deviation from the previous experience. No doubt, it was annoying, but it was a necessary evil that Xavier had to endure in his pursuit of his goal to gain the knowledge on how to master the magic of this time. In that situation, anyone with half a brain would have discerned that they were unwanted there, they would have immediately recused themselves considering just how antagonistic the atmosphere was. The old man's aloofness was concealed by polite speech and unemotional words. Any sane thinking mind would have been able to detect this. But, this time, Xavier had decided to leave behind anything that was considered normal. In that short period, he decided to be the mad one. If they thought he was uncultured, he was going to show them just how incognizant he could be of others' feelings. He wasn't a troublemaker or anything of the sort. It wasn't consistent with his character as someone who did his best to stay out of any kind of trouble that can be avoided. But right now, he had seen a shortcut to his goal, the white-bearded old man. Without even trying to look, Xavier had found the perfect source, and the fastest route to learning magic. Laddie was just perfect for Xavier. He was a venerated mage of high repute. And since he was a direct tutor of the governor's kids, it was safe to say that he was also discreet. The old man ticked all the required boxes for Xavier. This was pretty ironic because, in the other man's mind, it was the exact opposite. Xavier ticked none of the boxes in the older man's books. This clash of interests looked like it was going to be the basis of another friction that would usher in a fresh new wave of drama. A willing student and a very reluctant teacher was never often the case. Most times, it was almost always the other way around. It was a dynamic that was both unusual and unlikely. So, instead of retreating to the background which had been relegated to him, Xavier took a deep breath and stepped forward, almost in a challenging manner. Looking the old man squarely in the eye, Xavier asked the question he was sure would provoke a conversation. "Forgive me for asking, Master, but what exactly is your motive behind asking your student to manipulate the water to revolt against the bucket?" The old man looked at Xavier as if he had asked the dumbest question in the history of dumb questions. He managed to contain his emotions and answered without any vitriol. Why would you, a person who possesses practically no mana, be interested in this exercise? Xavier shrugged. I'm just curious really. I figured no harm would come from seeking out knowledge while I can. Regardless of any deterring factor, I will always seek out knowledge. The younger man was keenly trying to court the older man's attention. As one who had been a student once, Xavier knew that there was no quicker way to incur a teacher's goodwill by appearing to thirst for knowledge. But the old man wasn't easily seduced. Your ambition is noble one. But I am afraid that without mana, there are some things that just can't be properly taught and understood. You may gain the knowledge, but that would be it. He took a soft jab at Xavier's ego with his next statement. It's like trying to teach an ostrich how to fly. Interrupting the old man's train of thought, Berline's colorful personality chipped in eagerly, ostrich. More like a hippopotamus. There's no hope for this one. Quiet. The old man thundered. After rebuking his truant student one last time, he turned back to Xavier, hoping to continue his lecture. Surprisingly, Xavier was no longer paying attention. His eyes had that faraway look in his eyes that strongly suggested that he was actually lost in thought. Wondering what had captured the young man's attention in this manner, the old man followed his gaze and traced the source of his distraction. It turned out that Xavier had been focused on the boy's futile attempts to use the water to destroy the bucket. The old man saw the look of wonder and fascination in Xavier's eyes as he watched the young boy go at his task. In the background, Berline was mumbling something about this being a waste of her time, however no one paid her any attention. The boy's attention was on his bucket. Xavier's whole attention was on the boy, and the old man's focus was on Xavier. So, when Xavier finally spoke up with the question that had been brewing in his mind, the old man wasn't entirely surprised. Is the boy's ultimate aim to destroy the bucket using the water? The old man didn't like it, but he found himself getting impressed by the young stranger. Despite the fact that he had no mana, his deduction on the exercise was spot on. Just as the old man opened his mouth to reply him, once again, the chatty, hopelessly loquacious Erline beat him to the chase. Her loud voice rose above the regular conversation volume and rang through the courtyard. Of course that's the whole point. Are you blind? What sort of baseless question is that? Erline was frustrated by the fact that she was constantly failing at the task that had been set before her. So, she found an easy target in Xavier, and continued to bash him at any chance she got. This gambit was starting to get old, so because he was getting bored of the whole thing, Xavier stopped paying her any kind of attention whatsoever. He began to ignore so hard that she started to doubt her own existence. He continued his dialogue with the old man. Well, I don't think that is expedient at all. He saw the questioning look on the old man's face and immediately reiterated his initial statement, but in a more simple and defining lingo. I mean, it's not necessary to use magic to destroy the bucket, I easily accomplished that using a specific set of tools. Chapter 80 Capability. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Xavier might have easily said he could stop make it rain. It wasn't just what he had said, it was the suave confidence that followed his words, like it was nothing to him. As if he could easily do it with his eyes closed and without breaking a sweat. His words rang through the courtyard like with the blasphemous speed of a bad report or a profane speech. Even the sound of the water rushing in the background from the fountain seemed to have stopped. The shock was quickly replaced by a sweeping tide of unbelief. That was the sequence of emotional reactions to Xavier's claim, at least for Erline and her brother. However, the white-bearded old man's reaction was quite different. A cloud of anger crept across the senior mage's face. The old man was annoyed for several reasons. He was riled because Xavier had so casually set magic aside, despite the fact that he had no mana at all. He was annoyed because Xavier had so openly castigated his method of teaching, and in the presence of his students. Blood shot to his head, filling him with rage and disgust at the impudence of the young stranger. At this point, even the talkative Erline was stunned. It was rare to see her lost for words. Her busy eyes were busy calculating the odds of Xavier's assertion being true. If indeed what Xavier said was correct, then she never had to waste this much time trying to use mana. Her face was brightened with the hope of the fact that in the near future, she wouldn't have to do this anymore. Even Erline's brother, who all this time had been assiduously practicing his water magic, stopped practicing when Xavier's bombshell dropped. It was like his eyes had been opened to a new world filled with hidden secrets. If there was a way to skip this arduous process, he was more than willing to take it. So, he looked to Xavier anxiously, waiting for him to spill the beans. Just as he had suspected, Xavier had managed to infect his entire students' minds with this unrealistic ideology and empty boasting. In one moment, Xavier had completely undone what the old man had been trying to build for years. It irked him that none of his students, not even one of them had even turned to him for guidance, or at least, to even ask if what Xavier had just said was possible. They simply opened their eyes and ears like a bunch of goldfish and gobbled it all up. The senior mage's eyes boiled deep in his sockets. It was his principle of strict adherence to proper manners that prevented him from cursing out Xavier in the vilest way possible. If Xavier hadn't been a valued and celebrated guest of the city and of the governor, the old man would have used the same magic, which Xavier had so casually looked down on, to sweep him off his feet. Livid with fury, the old man bit down on his tongue. Etiquette could be a suppressing prison sometimes. Seeing that he was bound by principle, and therefore couldn't properly vent his anger on Xavier, he turned his wrath on Adelia and glared at her with all the suppressed venom in his being. Adelia was no fool. She had lived long enough with this people to know and understand their natures. So, when the old man finally turned to face her in his great wrath, she instantly understood the message in his eyes without the old man having to speak his truth. "Where this you get this scum from?" his eyes seemed to say. He tightened his face in a grimace in a way that clearly told her to get rid of this liar immediately. Completely in sync with the old man's secret message, Adelia began to work up the nerve to tell her truth. "Master Laddie," she began in a respectful tone, "I realize that Xavier's assertions might seem a bit overbearing, but I am a living testimony of his skills." She coughed and added in a low tone, "however unconventional they may be." Before anyone could get hung up on the wrong details, she continued with her original narrative, "So, believe me sir, if Xavier says he can do it, he most definitely can do it. The least we can do is to at least give him a chance to prove himself by doing exactly what he says he can do." Her words fell on the old man's ears like early morning dew on a parched land. The senior mage knew all his students well. He took great pride in knowing them well enough to predict their every move. Even though Adelia wasn't officially his student, she was attached to Erline, and consequently, she had spent a lot of time with the old man as he tutored them. In this period, the old man came to know Adelia as a sincere and honest soul who spoke the truth with no guile in her heart. So, hearing her openly vouch for this seemingly dubious young man made the old man take a step back to re-evaluate his own suppositions concerning the young man. It had been a long time since he had second-guessed himself. And yet, he just couldn't see how an ordinary man, who hadn't even the slightest trace of mana, could destroy a sturdy bucket of water without using magic. These clashing thoughts chased each other around in the old man's head, pressing against his frontal lobe, giving him the kind of headache that was born from serious deliberation. The two sides of the argument couldn't balance on the scales of logic. Adelia wasn't a liar, but at the same time, the old man knew that due to Xavier's lack of mana, it would be practically impossible to obliterate a sturdy bucket that was filled with magic. The boy who had been practicing his own water magic stopped everything he had been doing and now faced Xavier fully. His face was now a haven for doubts. He kept his gaze fixated on Xavier, expecting some kind of miracle to happen. As if the table wasn't full enough, as if the atmosphere wasn't tense enough, the two powerful men whom Xavier had kept waiting stepped into the scene. The governor's presence seemed to alter the mood of the courtyard. Behind him followed the Silver Knight Dale. Both men glided across the courtyard towards Xavier and the rest with a solemn expression on both their faces. They had spent several minutes scouring the grounds of the estate for Xavier. During that period, the governor began to suspect that Dale might have been hallucinating or delirious when he said that he had the hero of the Orc Fiesta on ground. They had sent servants everywhere, to look for Xavier. Coincidentally, the governor decided to use the opportunity to check in on his kids to see how well their tutoring was going. And to his great surprise, just a few meters to the courtyard, Dale picked up the echo of Xavier's voice coming from that direction. When Dale heard the cold familiar voice of the stranger, he alerted the governor excitedly. "Governor! He's here!" Expecting to see him behind them, Governor Quaid turned around abruptly. "Where?" he cried as he scanned the immediate environment with searching eyes. With the way Dale had called his attention, the governor had assumed that Xavier had appeared out of thin air like one of those mysterious mages who had the ability teleport. Dale dealt him a report that was both disappointing and at the same time elating. "Up ahead. He seems to be in that direction." The governor and the Silver Knight hurried towards that direction, eager to finally catch up with the elusive Xavier. As they approached, they heard the echo of Xavier's conversation with the old man. The governor looked at Dale with shocking disbelief when he heard Xavier's bold assertion. This was how they came to be present with Xavier and the others at this point. When Xavier saw Dale coming with another middle-aged man, he immediately guessed that the other man was the governor. It was in the way Dale huddled behind him, and the long, confident, purposeful strides of the governor. Also, the resemblance between the man and Erline was clear. So, with all of these factors, Xavier came to the logical conclusion that this was the governor indeed. Even as Xavier came to realize this, he was retained a calmness that was both shocking and unnerving. Anyone would expect a commoner to become jittery in the presence of a powerful figure such as the governor. Again, Xavier shocked everyone in this regard. In fact, Xavier's reaction was the polar opposite. He seemed to be a bit relieved that the governor and Dale had chosen that very moment to appear. It wasn't because he was doubtful of his own capability. No, far from it.